The Mosquito's starboard engine was streaming black smoke at 12,000 feet over the Dutch coast. Three Focke-Wulf 190s were closing from above in a perfect bracket formation, and Second Lieutenant David Archer made a decision that violated every tactical doctrine he'd been taught at Operational Training Unit. He pulled the throttle back, not forward into emergency power, not into a diving turn toward the deck, but back, bleeding off airspeed as tracer fire walked up through the space his aircraft had occupied half a second earlier. The lead German pilot, expecting the standard evasive brake, overshot by 300 yards, his wingmen following in disciplined trail. What happened in the next 40 seconds would not make headlines, would not earn a medal ceremony with photographers, but it would quietly change how reconnaissance missions over occupied Europe were approved, and who had the authority to question them. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. The mission brief had lasted 11 minutes on the morning of February 23, 1944, in a freezing Nissen hut at RAF Oakington, 8 miles northwest of Cambridge. Wing Commander Breslin had outlined it with the casual efficiency of a man reading a grocery list. Single aircraft photographic reconnaissance of the marshalling yards at Venlo, just inside the German border with Holland. Low-level approach to avoid radar detection. Egress route back across the Zuiderzee. Wheels up at 0647 hours. Weather deteriorating after 0900. Any questions? Flight Lieutenant Archer, recently promoted and still learning to stop flinching when senior officers addressed him directly, had raised his hand. The mission profile called for a solo run in a de Havilland Mosquito PR.16, a stripped-down reconnaissance variant with no defensive armament, extra fuel tanks where the guns should have been, and cameras mounted in the bomb bay. Fast, high-altitude work was the Mosquito's strength. This brief was asking him to go in low and slow, where the aircraft speed advantage meant nothing, and every anti-aircraft position from the coast to the target would have a clear shot. He pointed this out carefully, using phrases like respectfully suggest and alternative approach profile. Breslin had looked at him the way a headmaster looks at a student who's answered a question no one asked. The intelligence section wanted oblique photography, he'd said. That meant low level. The window for decent weather was closing. The target was time-sensitive. Berlin was moving munitions through Venlo at an accelerated rate, and Bomber Command needed those photographs before planning the next area raid. Archer would have cloud cover for most of the approach. The Germans wouldn't be expecting a lone aircraft at that altitude. It was a calculated risk, and the calculation had already been done by people with more experience than a 23-year-old from Surrey who'd been flying operationally for 7 months. Archer's navigator, Sergeant Peter Hollis, had caught his eye across the briefing table and given the smallest shake of his head. "Don't push it." Hollis was 31, a former schoolteacher from Nottingham with a wife and 2 daughters, and a pragmatic understanding of when arguing was useful and when it just marked you as someone who didn't follow orders. They'd flown together on 14 previous sorties, mostly high-altitude work over northern France, and Hollis had learned that Archer was cautious in a way that annoyed some of the other pilots, but it kept them both alive when crews with more confidence and less patience had failed to return. The Mosquito had lifted off into a gray February dawn, the Merlin engines settling into their characteristic smooth roar as Archer retracted the gear and began a climbing turn toward the North Sea. The cloud base was at 4,000 feet, solid overcast stretching east toward Holland. Archer leveled off at 8,000, just below the cloud deck, and trimmed the aircraft for cruise. Hollis was bent over his charts in the nose position, plotting checkpoints and calling course corrections through the intercom. They crossed the English coast at Felixstowe, dropped down to 2,000 feet over the water, and began the run toward the Dutch islands. The first problem appeared 30 miles from the coast. The cloud base that intelligence had promised was breaking up, shredding into scattered patches that left long stretches of open sky. Archer could see the Frisian Islands ahead, and beyond them the dark line of the Dutch mainland. No cover, no concealment, just a bright winter morning and a lone, unarmed reconnaissance aircraft about to cross into airspace, where the Luftwaffe had standing patrols, and every Wehrmacht unit had orders to fire on anything with RAF roundels. He checked his fuel state, calculated the time to target, and made the decision that would define the rest of the mission. He continued. Hollis didn't say anything, but Archer felt the silence through the intercom, the weight of unspoken judgment. They both knew this was already outside the mission parameters. Archer told himself that aborting would mean scrubbing the sortie, and scrubbing meant returning tomorrow or the next day, and by then the intelligence would be stale, and they'd be right back in this same situation with worse weather and even less justification. He told himself this was about completing the mission, about the photographs Bomber Command needed, about doing the job he'd been trained to do. He did not tell himself the truth, which was that he was afraid of going back to Breslin and admitting he'd turned around because the weather wasn't perfect, afraid of being labeled as overcautious, afraid of the look from the other pilots who'd somehow managed to complete missions that he'd aborted. He was 23 years old, and he was smarter than this, and he flew straight into the trap anyway. They crossed the Dutch coast at 1,000 feet, hugging the deck, the Mosquito's shadow racing across flat farmland and frozen canals. Anti-aircraft fire started immediately, black puffs of flak appearing ahead and to starboard, tracking left as the gun crews adjusted their aim. Archer jinked right, then left, keeping his turn shallow to maintain airspeed. The Merlin engines were screaming now, pushed to maximum continuous power, the airframe vibrating with the strain. Hollis called out landmarks, his voice tight and professional. A man doing his job while very aware that his survival depended entirely on the pilot's ability to not fly into a shell burst. The flak intensified as they approached Venlo, converging patterns of fire from multiple batteries. The gun crews now fully alert and coordinating their salvos. Archer dropped to 500 feet, threading between the bursts, feeling the aircraft shudder as shrapnel peppered the fuselage. The marshalling yards appeared ahead, a sprawl of rail tracks and warehouses and parked freight cars, exactly where the intelligence photos had placed them. Archer leveled the wings, held the Mosquito steady despite every instinct screaming at him to keep turning, and let the cameras run. 6 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds of straight and level flight, while Hollis worked the camera controls and German gunners walked their fire closer with each passing moment. Smoke trails from light flak were arcing up from the rail yard perimeter, 20mm rounds designed to shred aircraft skin and sever control cables. Then they were past the target, Archer rolling hard left and shoving the nose down, diving for the deck as more flak burst behind them. Hollis confirmed they'd gotten the photographs, his voice carrying a note of relief that he probably didn't intend. Archer set course for the egress route, northwest toward the Zuiderzee, and allowed himself to believe for perhaps 10 seconds that the mission would end with nothing worse than some shrapnel damage and an uncomfortable conversation with the engineering officer about the number of holes in the aircraft. The Focke-Wulfs came out of the sun. 3 of them, FW-190A8s from Jagdgeschwader 1, diving from 15,000 feet in a textbook attack formation. The lead pilot had seen the Mosquito minutes earlier, had climbed to altitude to gain the energy advantage, and was now executing the kind of intercept that German fighter pilots had been practicing since 1940. Hollis spotted them first, a strangled warning through the intercom, and Archer looked up through the canopy to see 3 dark shapes growing rapidly larger against the morning sky, their noses already sparking with cannon fire. Archer's first instinct, trained through hundreds of hours of simulated combat, was to firewall the throttles and run. The Mosquito was faster than a Focke-Wulf in level flight, and if he could build enough airspeed before they closed the gap, he might outpace them long enough to reach the coast and the relative safety of RAF fighter cover. He pushed both throttles forward to the gate, felt the Merlins respond, watched the airspeed indicator climb through 280 knots. The German fighters were still closing. 400 yards. 300 yards. The math was simple and brutal. They had altitude, which meant energy. They had momentum. They had guns. He had speed that hadn't built yet, and an unarmed aircraft that couldn't fight back. The starboard engine exploded. Not a gradual failure, not a cough and a sputter, but a catastrophic detonation as a 20mm cannon round punched through the cowling and shattered something vital in the supercharger assembly. Black smoke erupted from the nacelle, flame licking back along the wing route, and the Mosquito yawed violently to the right as the engine seized and the propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Archer fought the controls, left rudder, opposite aileron, trimming frantically to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. The airspeed was bleeding off. 260 knots, 240, 220. The aircraft wallowing now. A crippled target hanging in the sky, while 3 German fighters repositioned for the kill. Hollis was silent in the navigator's position, understanding with perfect clarity that there was nothing he could do, that his survival was entirely in Archer's hands, and that Archer was flying a damaged aircraft with 1 engine against 3 of the most lethal fighters in the Luftwaffe inventory. The German pilots would have seen the smoke, would have known the Mosquito was crippled, would have been calling to each other over the radio in clipped professional German, coordinating the next attack to make absolutely certain of the kill. Archer looked at his instruments. Single-engine airspeed holding at 210 knots. Altitude 12,000 feet. Fuel state sufficient for another 40 minutes if the remaining engine held together. 3 Focke-Wulfs repositioning above and behind. The lead aircraft already rolling into his attack dive. Distance to the coast 23 miles. Might as well have been 1,000. Every tactical manual, every training lecture, every combat report he'd ever read said the same thing in this situation. Try to outrun them if possible. If not possible, try to evade until you can reach cloud cover or friendly territory. If that fails, prepare to abandon aircraft and pray the parachute deploys cleanly. Archer looked at the throttle lever for the remaining port engine, already pushed forward to maximum power, already giving him everything the Merlin had to offer. He looked at the 3 German fighters setting up their attack, professional and patient and absolutely certain of the outcome. He looked at the airspeed indicator showing 210 knots, which was fast enough to keep the Mosquito controllable, but nowhere near fast enough to escape. And then David Archer, who had finished second in his class at navigation school and first in his class at instrument training, who preferred mathematics to intuition and preparation to improvisation, made a decision that his instructors would have failed him for suggesting. He reached forward and pulled the throttle back. The airspeed began dropping immediately. 200 knots, 190, 180. The Mosquito was still flying, still controllable, but now it was decelerating in a combat situation where every knot of speed meant survival and every second of hesitation meant death. Hollis felt the change through the airframe, the subtle shift in engine noise and slipstream buffet, and his voice came through the intercom sharp with confusion and fear. "David, what are you doing?" Archer didn't answer. He was watching the lead Focke-Wulf, now 300 yards behind and closing fast. The German pilot lining up his shot with the calm precision of someone who'd done this dozens of times before. The FW-190 was faster, more maneuverable, and armed with 4 20mm cannon and 2 machine guns. In a turning fight, it would cut the Mosquito to pieces. In a straight chase, it would close the distance and fire until nothing remained but burning wreckage, falling toward the Dutch countryside. But the German pilot was making a calculation based on what Allied aircraft always did in this situation, which was run at maximum power, try to build distance, try to survive long enough for something to change. Archer was doing the opposite, and he was doing it for a reason that had crystallized in his mind the moment the engine had failed. The Focke-Wulf was closing at a combined speed of over 150 knots, diving from altitude, trading height for velocity in the attack profile that every fighter pilot learned in basic training. The German had calculated his firing solution based on the Mosquito maintaining 210 knots or trying to accelerate. He had not calculated for a target that was actively slowing down. The closure rate was now too high, the angle of attack too steep, and the German pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to recognize the problem and adjust. He didn't adjust in time. The Focke-Wulf screamed past the Mosquito's tail, overshooting by 300 yards. The German pilot's cannon fire tearing through empty air where Archer's aircraft should have been but wasn't. The 2 wingmen, flying in disciplined formation, followed their leader through the overshoot, their own firing solutions now completely disrupted. Archer watched them flash past, gray-green camouflage and black crosses, so close he could see the individual panel lines and the oil streaks on the engine cowlings. Then they were ahead of him, pulling up and banking hard to reposition, their energy advantage momentarily negated by the unexpected maneuver. Archer pushed the throttle back to maximum power. The single Merlin engine roared, the the propeller biting into the cold air, and the Mosquito began accelerating again. 180 knots, 190, 200. He was still slower than the German fighters, still outgunned, still flying a crippled aircraft over enemy territory. But he'd bought himself perhaps 30 seconds, and 30 seconds was enough time to think. The Focke-Wulfs were climbing now, regaining altitude for another attack. The lead pilot would be angry, Archer thought, embarrassed. A textbook intercept had turned into a miss because the target had done something no Allied pilot would normally attempt, something that looked like either a brilliant tactical decision or the panic response of someone who'd forgotten which direction the throttle was supposed to move. The German wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The next attack would be more cautious, more deliberate, with better spacing between the fighters to prevent all three from overshooting simultaneously. Hollis found his voice again. That was either the smartest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest thing I've ever seen, and I genuinely don't know which. Neither do I, Archer said, and he meant it. The maneuver had worked once because of surprise and timing and a German pilot who'd been expecting predictable behavior. It would not work a second time. The Focke-Wulfs were repositioning now, the lead aircraft climbing to 14,000 feet, the wingmen spreading out to cover different attack angles. They would come in staggered, forcing Archer to choose which threat to defend against, and whichever choice he made would leave him vulnerable to one of the others. This was how experienced fighter pilots killed reconnaissance aircraft, not through individual brilliance, but through coordinated patience and superior numbers. Archer looked at his fuel gauge. 35 minutes remaining. Distance to the coast, 19 miles. The damaged starboard engine was still streaming smoke, a banner visible for miles advertising his position to every German unit in the sector. He could not outrun them. He could not outfight them. He could not hide. The only advantage he had, the only thing keeping him alive, was that he was willing to do things that didn't make sense, and he was smart enough to do them at exactly the right moment. The lead Focke-Wulf began its attack run, diving from 14,000 feet in a shallower angle this time, building speed more gradually, giving himself more time to adjust if the target did something unexpected. Archer watched him come, calculating distances and closure rates with the same methodical precision he'd used to navigate across the North Sea in zero visibility. The German was being cautious now, professional, not committing fully until he was certain of the shot. The two wingmen were holding position high and to either side, ready to attack if Archer tried to break in their direction. Archer waited. 180 knots indicated airspeed. Altitude 11,000 feet, having lost 1,000 during the first engagement. The lead Focke-Wulf was at 800 yards now, still diving, still building speed. 600 yards. 400 yards. The Germans' cannon would be effective at 300 yards, lethal at 200. Archer's hand was on the throttle, and every instinct was screaming at him to do something. Turn, dive, climb. Anything except continue straight and level while a fighter closed to killing range. At 350 yards, Archer pulled the throttle back again and simultaneously rolled the Mosquito into a steep left bank. Not a level turn, not a dive, but a banking descent that scrubbed off airspeed while presenting the smallest possible target profile to the attacking fighter. The Germans' first burst of cannon fire went high, the pilot instinctively leading the target based on its previous airspeed. The Focke-Wulf flashed overhead, close enough that Archer felt the turbulence from its slipstream rocking the Mosquito's wings. The German had anticipated the deceleration this time, had started to compensate, but the combination of reduced speed and the banking turn had thrown off his solution by just enough. One of the wingmen was already attacking, diving from the right, his timing perfect to catch Archer in the recovery from the first evasion. Archer didn't try to evade. He continued the left banking turn, tightening it, pulling the control column back, and feeling the Mosquito shudder as it approached the edge of a stall. The airspeed indicator was dropping through 140 knots, dangerously slow for a twin-engine aircraft with one engine failed, slow enough that the stall warning was buzzing in his headset. The attacking Focke-Wulf couldn't match the turn radius, not at the speed it was carrying, and it broke off high and to the right, its cannon fire raking empty air 50 yards behind the Mosquito's tail. Hollis was gripping the sides of his position in the nose, watching the altimeter unwind through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000, watching the airspeed hover at 135 knots, with the stall warning screaming and the aircraft shuddering on the edge of controllability. He understood what Archer was doing now, understood the terrible logic of it. The Focke-Wulfs were faster, better armed, and more maneuverable in any normal engagement. But they couldn't fly this slowly, without stalling themselves, and they couldn't make their firing solutions work against a target that kept changing speeds in ways that violated every tactical assumption. Archer was fighting the only way an unarmed reconnaissance aircraft could fight, by being unpredictable enough that the enemy couldn't kill him, and by staying alive long enough that something might change. The third Focke-Wulf attacked from above, a vertical dive intended to eliminate the vertical separation and give Archer nowhere to maneuver. Archer saw it coming, waited until the German committed to the dive angle, then pushed the throttle forward and rolled wings level. The Merlin engine responded, the Mosquito accelerated out of the turn, and the German's cannon fire tore through the space, where Archer had been 3 seconds earlier. The Focke-Wulf pulled out of its dive 2,000 feet below, the pilot pulling hard to avoid overshooting into the ground, his aircraft's gray camouflage briefly visible against the brown Dutch farmland. 3 attacks, 3 misses, and the German pilots were now spread across several thousand feet of sky, their formation broken, their coordinated tactics disrupted by a target that refused to behave like a target should behave. Archer knew this was temporary. The Germans would regroup, would climb back to altitude, would try again with even more caution and even better spacing. Eventually his luck would run out, or his fuel would run out, or he would make a mistake with the throttle timing and stall the aircraft into the ground. But every attack he survived was another minute closer to the coast, another mile closer to safety, another 30 seconds that he and Hollis remained alive. The lead German pilot was climbing back to altitude, but slower now, his movements less aggressive. Archer recognized the change in behavior, the shift from aggressive pursuit to cautious evaluation. The German had just spent 3 attack runs trying to shoot down an unarmed reconnaissance aircraft, and had failed all 3 times. He was now reassessing, wondering if perhaps this British pilot was more skilled than he'd initially appeared, wondering if continuing the engagement was worth the fuel and ammunition expenditure. German pilots in early 1944 were well trained and experienced, but they were also increasingly aware that every sortie had to count, that losses couldn't be easily replaced, that wasting resources on a single crippled Mosquito might mean being unavailable for a larger raid later in the day. Archer saw the moment the German made his decision. The Focke-Wulf formation reformed at 15,000 feet, circled once above the Mosquito, then turned southeast toward their base. They didn't leave because Archer had defeated them in combat. They left because he'd made the engagement too expensive, too time-consuming, too uncertain of outcome. They left because continuing to chase a target that kept doing inexplicable things with its throttle and bank angle was no longer a rational use of their tactical position. Hollis watched them go, watched the 3 gray shapes grow smaller against the morning sky, and released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "They're leaving." "Yes," Archer said. His voice was steady, but his hands on the control column were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up to his nervous system. The Mosquito was still flying on one engine, still trailing smoke, still over enemy territory with 19 miles to go before reaching the coast. But the immediate threat was gone, and that was enough for now. They flew northwest in silence, Archer nursing the remaining engine and watching the fuel gauge with the attention of someone who understood that survival depended on making the numbers work. The Dutch coast appeared ahead, the Zuiderzee dark and cold under the February sun. Anti-aircraft fire rose from coastal positions, but half-hearted. The gun crews tracking them, but not seriously expecting to hit a fast-moving aircraft at that altitude. Archer crossed the coastline at 6,000 feet, continued out over the water, and finally allowed himself to believe they might actually make it home. The landing at Oakington was an exercise in controlled disaster. Single-engine approaches were difficult in any aircraft, lethal in a Mosquito with its high wing loading and tendency to snap roll if mishandled. Archer brought it in high and fast, using altitude as insurance against the engine quitting at the worst possible moment, then slipped the aircraft down to the runway threshold and planted it firmly on the main gear. The remaining engines sounded rough, exhausted, barely holding together. He shut it down as soon as they cleared the active runway, and the sudden silence was profound. The engineering officer who examined the aircraft counted 47 shrapnel holes in the fuselage and wings, one destroyed engine that would need complete replacement, damaged hydraulics, a severed fuel line that had somehow not caught fire, and stress cracks in the port wing spar from the violent maneuvering. He told Archer it was a miracle the aircraft had stayed in one piece. Archer didn't disagree. Wing Commander Breslin's after-action interview was brief and cold. The photographs were excellent quality, exactly what Bomber Command had requested, and the intelligence section was pleased. But the mission had resulted in a severely damaged aircraft, had nearly cost 2 crew members their lives, and had apparently involved combat maneuvering that Breslin described as unorthodox to the point of recklessness. Archer's written report, which carefully detailed the decision to continue the mission despite deteriorating weather conditions, the flak damage over the target, and the subsequent fighter engagement, was filed without comment. There was no medal recommendation, no commendation, no recognition beyond a brief mention in the squadron operations log. But something did change, quietly, in the weeks that followed. Reconnaissance mission briefings became longer, more detailed, with more attention paid to abort criteria and alternative approach profiles. Pilots began asking more questions about weather conditions and enemy fighter activity, and those questions were answered seriously rather than dismissed. The rigid hierarchy that had prevented a junior officer from questioning a mission profile began to soften, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement that the person actually flying the aircraft might have insights worth considering. The change was incremental, undramatic, the kind of institutional learning that happens slowly, and without fanfare, when people realize that overconfidence and rigid planning can get crew members killed. Archer flew 14 more operational sorties before the war ended, all of them uneventful, all of them completed according to plan. He was promoted to flight lieutenant, then to squadron leader, and eventually transferred to a staff position where he helped write tactical doctrine for photo reconnaissance operations. His contribution to those manuals was subtle but significant. An emphasis on mission planning that accounted for the pilot's tactical judgment, criteria for mission abort that prioritized crew survival over target completion, and a section on defensive tactics for unarmed aircraft that included, buried in the technical language, a brief discussion of using deliberate speed reduction to disrupt enemy firing solutions. The Focke-Wulf pilots who'd attacked him that morning over Holland survived the war, returned to civilian life, and never knew the name of the British pilot who'd kept slowing down when he should have been speeding up. Years later, one of them, interviewed for a German aviation history project, mentioned a strange encounter in February 1944 with a crippled Mosquito that had evaded 3 coordinated attacks through what he described as either exceptional luck or exceptional skill. He was never sure which. The interviewer asked if he thought the British pilot had simply panicked and made random inputs on the controls. The German pilot, now a retired commercial airline captain, thought about this carefully before answering. No, he said. Someone who panics doesn't survive 3 attack runs. That pilot knew exactly what he was doing, even if what he was doing made no sense at the time. David Archer never spoke publicly about the mission. When asked about his war service at post-war reunions and memorial events, he described himself as a reconnaissance pilot who'd been fortunate to survive, nothing more. He didn't mention the morning he'd ignored the evidence of deteriorating weather because he was afraid of being called overcautious. He didn't mention the moment he'd realized the mission should never have been approved, that the risk calculation had been wrong from the beginning, that he and Hollis had been sent into impossible circumstances because someone in a briefing room had underestimated the danger and overestimated the reward. And he didn't mention the realization that had come to him during those few seconds when he'd first pulled the throttle back, which was that sometimes the only way to survive a situation was to do the thing that every instinct and every training manual said was wrong, and to do it with enough precision and timing that luck began to look like skill. The mission photographs were used to plan a bombing raid on Venlo that occurred 3 weeks later. And sometimes, when the circumstances were wrong and the risks too high, not approved at all. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and judgment change history, subscribe for more. Intelligence without courage is merely knowledge. Courage without intelligence is merely recklessness. David Archer survived that February morning because he possessed both, and because he understood that sometimes the smartest decision is the one that looks, to everyone watching, like the stupidest mistake you could possibly make.